Hello and welcome back. And that's right, did you notice like a weird noise over the weekend? Well, that was probably Amazon UK and B&H absolutely dropping a clanger by accidentally outing the new Seagate Firecuda 540. That's right, Seagate have drawn first blood when it comes to the main SSD storage media names out there, your WDs, your Samsungs and your Seagates, in order to drop their Gen 5 SSD. And although they are not the first by any shape or form to release or at least unveil a Gen 5 SSD, they are one, I would say, the top three out there that people have been waiting on for the mainstream Gen 5 SSD of choice. And the Seagate Firecuda 540, all the information that dropped, and again I think massive credit should go out to Momomo US Twitter user who pretty much outed it for everyone else and every other news outlet out there. With that thanks, we should talk a lot more about what exactly the Seagate Firecuda 540 is, what it's coming with, how it compares to the 530, why it's a big deal, when it's coming, price, the lot. It's all going to be in this video. But straight off the bat, let's talk about the hardware specifications of this drive, what we know so far. So straight away, it is a Gen 5 x4 M2 SSD. So again, 2280, arriving in 1TB, 2TB, and a slightly kind of but not fully confirmed 4TB model out there. And again, this is utilizing 3D TLC NAND, although we don't know the layer count yet. We can expect it to be moderately high due to another factor we'll talk about later on. In terms of performance, we seem to be having a reported 10 gigabyte over 10 gigabyte sequential read write on the 2TB model there. Again, that write might be 9.5. When it comes to the 1TB model, we have got a 9.5 gig reported performance there at sequential read, and a sequential write 8.5. Obviously, the 1TB and the 2TB, as you go smaller down the capacities, the distribution of NAND on these drives result in a lower performance value. Now, in terms of the controller, we still don't have confirmation of the controller inside, but we can be 99.999% certain it's going to be the Phison E26 controller. Notwithstanding, it's very much the go-to SSD controller of the Gen 5 generation, but also because Seagate has typically gone parallel with Phison when the Gen 4 generation first rolled out with the Phison E16 controller. Seagate leapt onto that, and then the E18 controller, and they leapt on that. So I think it's pretty logical they're going to go for this E26. Again, there are other controllers out there, the Integrate IG5666 or the SM2508 from Silicon Motion. I know this is a bit inside baseball, but the point I'm making is that although there are other options out there, Seagate is almost always going to go Phison. The working relationship between these two brands and development has always been pretty darn phenomenal. We don't know much about the memory, the DRAM there. It's definitely going to have DRAM, although there are DRAM-less SSD controllers out there. I think the E31T from Phison, this is not going to be one of those. Seagate doesn't really dabble much into that DRAM-less SSD market. In terms of durability, man alive, that is some good stuff, with this drive reporting and quite incredible 2,000 terabytes written on the 2TB model, according to the specifications leaked on those pages, which equates to around about 0.5 to 0.6 drive writes per day. To put that into perspective, most other SSDs right now in the Gen 5 generation are about 0.3, 0.38 drive writes per day. Drive writes per day being how often you can fully write to the disk to its fullest capacity there. The point I'm making there is that much like previous generations of not only the Seagate Firecuda series that we've seen previous, but also things like the Iron Wolf series, Seagate has always kind of championed high durability on their drives. And although the mean time between failure, reported at 1.5 million hours on this drive, is fairly middling for the rest of Gen 5 x4, it is that durability factor which has always put the Seagate drives ahead of everyone else, when their drives have always been a lower terabytes written or drive writes per day rating per capacity across the field. And if they're going to utilize the same controller as a number of other Gen 5 SSDs in the market, the only way you're going to be able to maintain that higher standard of durability is either to create a larger distribution of NAND across the SSD back and front, or have a higher layer count on that 3D TLC NAND inside there. So consequently, much like their previous generation, again, we've got the Mandalorian version of the Firecuda 530 here. much like that drive arrived with 176 layer 3D TLC NAND, I won't be surprised if we'd be cranking towards the 212 layer perhaps, but again, we've got zero confirmation at this time. Again, in terms of pricing, it looks like they're going by the B&H leak there. The 1TB is $189 and $319 for the 2TB model, and that includes the likes of Seagate's Rescue Recovery Service rolled in there and 5 years of manufacturer's warranty as well. Again, release, we don't have a vast amount of information on, to be frank with you, but given it's leaked on those pages this early, it seems like it's going to be imminent, if not within the next few days, given the level of information that was on there, the official images and more. And indeed, as far as official images go, although there is the baseline model that doesn't arrive with a heatsink, something we'll talk about in a bit, I will say that the bare model has got a graphene metallic panel there on the front, something we're seeing more and more with these newer generation SSDs that can get very, very hot indeed. But also they've got a couple of official first party, presumably EK heatsinks there, something we've seen before. Again, this Mandalorian one here, again, one of the prettiest SSDs I've ever seen. They are releasing two different kinds of Gen 5 SSD heatsink on these new 540 Firecuda drives there, a white and blue one with a lovely kind of hex pattern there, and another one that's a little bit more comparable to the existing heatsink range. So now we've gone over the specifications and everything we know, let's talk about the significance of this drive, because again, as I mentioned in the introduction, Seagate were not the first to break out a Gen 5 SSD. Indeed, by my count, they might be like the 12th or 13th mainline SSD brand or no name out there to release an SSD. So why is Seagate entering this market so dang significant? Well, nice and simple, because when it comes to most mainstream SSD buyers, and particularly home and prosumer users, not just hardcore gamers and content creators and people that are really able to leverage that performance, the likes of Seagate, your WDs and your Samsungs, these brands, although they have a finger in every pie of enterprise down to home user, they are the ones that will wait for a very specific time in any kind of industry tier before they leap in. Go in too early and you end up producing a solution that only no one's going to adopt, but also in the time that everyone else waits, the innovations within that industry get better and better and more efficient, that you can run the risk of not being there when a industry or a particular tier of a market explodes. Look at the Gen 4 generation, with some brands holding off quite a significant amount of time before they release their Gen 4 drive. And that's what Seagate have clearly done here. They have sat on the fence and waited till that point in the market for market saturation, but also market adoption of Gen 5 was at its optimal point. The point I'm making here is that with Seagate releasing their Firecuda 540, it cannot be long before we see a WD and Samsung entry. In the Gen 4 generation, Seagate entered it very, very early with their Firecuda 520 drive using their Phison E16 controller, and that SSD was followed, I think, a maximum 6 or 7 months by everyone else. So Seagate releasing this drive here is going to make things get super competitive, which frankly is always good for the consumer there. And the Firecuda arriving with a bunch of fully fledged, heat sinks, which again, as we mentioned, heat sinks are going to be fantastically important in the Gen 5 generation, only goes to further illustrate that point that Seagate have waited and waited here for an optimal point in this market field, in this market for Gen 5 SSDs, and we're going to see this followed to quite significantly and very, very soon by other brands in the SSD market. Now, obviously, we're going to review this SSD on the channel when we've got hold of one, and although those SSD speeds that we're seeing of that, if it is for the 2TB, 10 gig over 10 gig for sequential performance there, and again 2 million IOPS I should add as well, with those performance numbers, it doesn't put this drive at the fastest ones in the market. That goes, I believe, to ADATA right now with their 14 gig over 12 gig SSD, which is taking advantage of the Silicon Motion SSD controller, that SM2508. But for now, this is going to be Seagate's first wave in a multi-wave approach. And whether we see pro versions or industry versions, it's going to be interesting to see. But now the affordability of Gen 5 has increased substantially for a lot of home users, it's SSDs like this that are going to make Gen 5 more affordable. It's going to make Gen 5 more appealing and accessible for many, and hopefully the rest of the IT infrastructure of CPUs, controller boards and more will meet up to this challenge so we can make the most of these. But right now, this is a multi-stage thing of client hardware now allowing these SSDs to stretch their muscles, something that maybe we're not quite at. But what do you think of Seagate's new Firecuda 540 SSD? Are you going to buy one? Are you thinking about getting one? Or are you just sitting out the Gen 5 generation a little bit longer till either it gets a little bit more affordable or the client hardware that surrounds it can eke a lot more out of it? Let me know in the comments. There should be an article below linked over to NAScompares, which will update with more information as it arrives. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.